To me, weight neutrality means that a person's worth and value are not based on their weight whatsoever. However, that doesn't mean that we can't be honest about the fact that it can affect their health.
Raise your hand if bringing up a patient's weight makes you uncomfortable. Okay, I get it, because finding that balance between acceptance and risk reduction can be so hard. Welcome back to the Exam Room Nutrition Podcast, your guide to giving better nutrition advice. I'm your host, Colleen Sloan. I'm a PA and dietitian, and today I'm joined by Dr. Tzvi Doron, a board-certified family and obesity medicine physician and a diplomat of the American Board of Clinical Lipidology. He's a clinician, educator, and health tech leader who helped design clinical protocols at Roe, and he's passionate about using nutrition and exercise as medicine. So I picked his brain about all things weight management. We talked about finding that compassionate middle ground between weight-neutral philosophies and medical weight reduction. We talk about what actually happens to lipids with weight loss, because I can't be the only one who thinks that lipid metabolism is hard. I also got Dr. Doron's take on the carnivore and keto diet, and you will absolutely love his judgment approach here. And we can't talk about weight loss without addressing the importance of protecting lean mass. In the final segment, we talk about protein needs and the importance of resistance training. And lastly, I end with a big question. What does success in obesity treatment look like to you? But before we get into this conversation, just a quick invitation for you to sign up for my free weekly newsletter. Not only do I share stories from clinic and lessons from my transition into academia, but I've been sharing fabulous fall recipes from dietitians in my community. I'm currently obsessed with a protein pumpkin chia seed pudding. That's a mouthful, but it's delicious. And my PA pal Rachel said, I love getting your emails. They have so much good content. So you can sign up for free at examroomnutrition.com/sign up, or the link will be in the show notes. All right, well, get comfy or drive safe and enjoy my conversation with Dr. Doron. Dr. Doron, thank you so much for coming on to the show. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I'm really, really excited to unpack this topic with you and just kind of pick your brain so you can share some wisdom with us. And, I wanted to start out with the tension that we see between some of the weight neutral approaches, specifically the health at every size, and then the medical focus on weight reduction for disease prevention. There's a tension between that. So I would love to hear your perspective on how do we find that balanced, compassionate middle ground between the two?
Yeah, so first of all, I think that health at every size and other sort of related movements came about due to good motives and intentions. And that's basically because there's a massive amount of bias against people with obesity. So I think that the intentions were good. Having said that, I do think that we have to be honest about the fact that carrying excess adiposity is detrimental to health in many situations. I would argue in most situations, it's just a matter of how long you wait until you see those outcomes. And therefore, I would like to reorient the idea of weight neutrality. To me, weight neutrality means that a person's worth and value are not based on their weight whatsoever. However, that doesn't mean that we can't be honest about the fact that it can affect their health. So I like to compare it to other diseases. Imagine a person has rheumatoid arthritis or systemic lupus or some other disease. We would never say that they're worth more or less based on their disease. Their disease is just a condition that they have. But we would still say that those things can affect their health, and we want to address them because it'll improve their lives and hopefully potentially lengthen their lives. And that's kind of the same way that I think about weight. A person's weight has no bearing on their value or worth, but it can affect their health. And that's the reason that we should address it as healthcare professionals.
Yeah, I love that. I really appreciate that approach of weight neutrality. And I've had a previous guest on, and we talked about how sometimes you don't have to always have body positivity. There is such this big push to always be positive and accept the body that you're in. And sometimes just being neutral about it is probably the healthier approach. And that brings me to my next question that I wanted to ask you is, how do you have those conversations with patients when you as the provider know that they would likely benefit from weight loss due to comorbidities or risk in the future, but that conversation can be kind of awkward and uncomfortable for clinicians and honestly the patient. So how do you frame that conversation without stigmatizing the patient?
Yeah. So it's a good question. First of all, it's probably becoming more common for patients to raise it themselves. Because of the explosion of awareness with GLP-1 agonists, patients are more likely to bring it up. But certainly there are many people who don't bring it up. And as a clinician, you may realize that, their weight is affecting different aspects of their health. For me, it's usually a pretty simple opening where I'll say something like, is it okay for us to talk about how your weight may be impacting your health? Which really closely mirrors what I said before about the weight neutrality, right? In other words, that's what I'm interested in, how your weight may be impacting your health. Nothing more and nothing less. And I've found that generally people respond pretty well to that. Clinicians should know this. Nothing is going to cover 100% of people because we're all different. So you have to just strive to do the best you can. And that's what I've found works for me.
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of asking permission first. You guys know this. It probably comes up on every episode that is like the first and most important thing you should do. Not only talking about their weight, but also asking about their dietary patterns and maybe diets they've tried in the past. And to never assume that the patient wants to lose weight. So I really love how you framed that. And I think that takes that, you know, magnifying glass off of maybe their body image or their worth or their values that culture has so tied to body size. And so that's a really, really good approach. Okay, so let's move into a bigger topic because when we connected on LinkedIn and I asked kind of what topics you wanted to bring up, and the big one was lipids because you had mentioned that lipid changes during weight loss don't get enough attention. So can you share with us what are some of those key shifts that you see with lipids when patients lose weight?
So, okay, so let's start a little bit with some of the lipid changes that people have just because of their weight. Most clinicians have seen the changes, but they don't necessarily understand where they're coming from. So this can be a very complicated story. I'm going to try to simplify it a little bit or a lot, really. And some of the scientists and biochemists or whoever researchers that may be listeners may take a little bit issue of, with the way that I'm simplifying it, but I'm still going to simplify it like this. I would like to think about three areas. Okay. We have the fat cells themselves, we have the liver, and we have sort of like the periphery, just like, doing its thing. In the state of obesity, we have really two things going on. We have the sort of excess adiposity in the fat cells, and we have oftentimes inflammation due to that, macrophages going into the fat cells and doing their thing. And we have insulin resistance. This does a few things. Number one, it increases the free fatty acids that the liver sees that are coming from the fat cells. So the fat cells are breaking down extra fat. This is called lipolysis, and putting those free fatty acids into the blood, and those are being seen by the liver. The liver itself is also making excess fat called de novo lipogenesis. And so now we have fat coming into the liver making its own fat. And then we also have triglyceride-rich like lipoproteins delivering their fat back to the liver. We have fat coming from all sides. And then the last place we can have it from is from the diet itself. If the person is eating excess calories or fructose, alcohol, these are the main things that will increase the fat delivered to the liver from the portal vein. Okay, what does the liver do? So we talked about the liver seeing all this extra fat. The liver has to do something with this fat. Unfortunately, some of it gets stored in the liver. We're not going to focus too much on that today. But the liver also packages that fat into what we call VLDLs, right? VLDLs, very low density lipoproteins that carry a lot of triglycerides. And the liver puts that out into the circulation. What do we see on the lipid panel? On the lipid panel, we see elevated triglycerides, right? Those triglycerides are, a lot of them are in the form of VLDLs. They could be in the form of chylomicrons, et cetera. Some of them are in the other cholesterol particles. So we see elevated triglycerides. We see low HDL. That's a complicated story. But here's the really important thing that we see. We often see a normal LDL cholesterol. And the reason for that is that LDL cholesterol in a regular lipid panel is really just looking at the concentration of cholesterol. It doesn't tell you how many particles, right? So we see a normal amount of cholesterol, but it's being carried in excessive particles. The other thing we see is that we see a larger than normal difference between the non-HDL cholesterol and the LDL cholesterol. Usually we think of this as more than 30 milligrams per deciliter. So for instance, if a person has an LDL of 100, an LDL cholesterol of 100, which many people wouldn't, blink at, they may have a non-HDL cholesterol of 170, right? Which would be more than what we would think that difference should be. So to summarize, we see, everybody has seen this already on many lipid panels. We see an increased non-HDL cholesterol. We can see a normal LDL cholesterol. We see an increased triglycerides and a low HDL cholesterol. That's on the regular lipid panel. Importantly, if you measure ApoB, you're often going to see a high ApoB in the setting of a normal LDL cholesterol. These are the normal changes. When people lose weight, what typically happens is HDL cholesterol will increase. It's a significant amount of weight. The triglycerides will decrease. But what happens to the other particles is variable. LDL cholesterol can go up or down or stay the same, depending on a lot of other factors, primarily diet. And ApoB, same thing, up, down, or the same. And I think that that's probably what we're going to get into next. Is what does that mean?
Yeah, a really good caveat you put out there is it's complicated. I mean, all of us remember from school, like lipid metabolism is tough stuff, right? So I think that was a really, really helpful summary and overview of kind of what's going on. But can you explain, how does weight loss help control or lower a patient's lipid levels?
Yeah, so the triglycerides are going to go down primarily because we're going to have better insulin sensitivity. The fat cells themselves are going to shrink, and that will lower also the amount of inflammation in the fat cells themselves. So again, some of the things I described before, the fat cells are going to be putting out less free fatty acids into the circulation. The liver is going to become more insulin sensitive. It's going to start lowering the amount of, de novo lipogenesis, making its own fat. And we're also going to see less coming in from the diet as well. So all the areas that I talked about, the HDL is basically, again, without getting too complicated, as insulin sensitivity goes up, usually those changes that make the HDL cholesterol decrease are going to go away, and the HDL cholesterol is going to increase.
Okay, if your heads are spinning with this and you want to learn more about lipids, don't worry, I have a really good episode for you. It's episode number 111. It's called HDL Good, LDL Bad. It's not that simple. In that episode, I interview a PA, PhD, and a clinical lipid specialist who unpacks the different labs that you can check that even go beyond HDL and LDL, just like Tzvi had mentioned, the ApoB, and we also unpack Lp(a), a lot more. So after this episode, go check out that one. You will really, really love it. Okay, I have a personal question, I guess. I'm very curious as to the impact of fasting on a patient's labs, and I'll give you a reason why. My dad is kind of my favorite patient that's not my patient. He came to me the other day and he said, "Oh, I just had McDonald's and I have to go get my blood work checked tomorrow. My cholesterol is going to be through the roof." So can you unpack those two things? How quickly does your diet impact the labs that are being checked? And do we truly have to be fasting when we get a lipid panel?
Yeah, so the recommendations for, a regular lipid panel for most people is that non-fasting is fine. The main lab that is affected by, what you ate like recently within the last several hours is the triglycerides themselves. And the reason for that is very simple. It's when we eat a meal, especially a meal that's, high in fat, the fats are going to be absorbed through the lymphatic system, actually. Your dietitian, listeners probably know this better than I do. They're going to be packaged into chylomicrons, and those chylomicrons are going to be in circulation, and they're going to affect the total triglyceride load, because triglyceride measured in the serum is basically all triglycerides, whether they're in chylomicrons and VLDLs and other particles, et cetera. The recommendations now are basically that if you have a triglycerides that are over 400, then you should do fasting labs. However, my opinion is as follows. That non-fasting triglyceride is still a big sign, because if you are not able to keep your triglycerides below 400, even in the postprandial or post-meal state, that still gives us a lot of information. That tells us a lot about your metabolism, your ability to, handle fats, probably your insulin, sensitivity and things like that. So even though, we recommend to redo the test fasting, that's partially because of LDL calculations and things like that. I actually think it's still pretty informative. And there have been studies that show that the non-fasting triglyceride levels still predict some bad things like pancreatitis and also cardiovascular risk.
Okay, so let's move into the different dietary patterns, but I'm curious to the effect of diets on the lipid story, especially during weight loss. So how does what a patient eats affect their lipids, especially when considering saturated fat diets?
Yeah, so this is quite important. And I've seen this many, many times. The things that are important for your health continue to be important for your health during weight loss. And you can do things that will cause weight loss, but be not great for other things. So in particular, diets that are high in saturated fat will often cause bad things to happen to the lipids, or more accurately, the lipoproteins, from a cardiovascular perspective. So diets that are high in saturated fat will increase LDL cholesterol levels, ApoB levels. Again, if you're measuring those, which I think people should, and that will still increase cardiovascular risk. We have no reason at this point to think that, people who are losing weight, but, increasing their LDL cholesterol, ApoB levels, are doing anything good for their cardiovascular risk. So high saturated fats, fat diets may, help with weight loss if they're, calorie controlled, but they may still be bad for cardiovascular health.
Yeah. And you said something important, that when we're working with a patient who's losing weight, it's not just about the weight. We also have to consider their long-term health, right? Their cognition, their bone health, their gut health. And so, yeah, they might lose a ton of weight on a high-fat diet, but what are we doing to them long-term? And I think that's an important thing that we also educate our patients about, because most of the time they are so desperate to just lose the weight, they'll almost do it at any cost. And I think we need to remind them, we want you to thrive well into your 70s, 80s, and maybe even your 90s, right? Okay, I want to get your opinion on two popular yet controversial diet patterns, and I just love to hear your thoughts on the carnivore diet and its kind of brother, the ketogenic diet for weight loss.
So I'm not a fan of either diet. I don't think that they're well balanced. I don't think that they address, a wide variety of, health concerns. But some people feel that they, help particularly with hunger. I think that they often have detrimental effects on lipids. You talked about gut health and brain health. Those are also affected by lower fiber, brain health. Basically, anything you can do that's bad for your heart is bad for your brain. Having said that, I also think it's important not to judge patients. So, like, if a patient is on one of those diets and, like, that they're committed to it, I don't think the idea is to sit there and lecture them and say, this is bad for you and you really should stop or whatever. Like, you should inform them, but at a certain point you have to work with them too. And therefore, I think that if people are committed to one of these because they're getting other benefits, I think you should offer them mitigation strategies, such as drugs to lower their ApoB and LDL cholesterol to mitigate the risk on their, cardiovascular and brain health. You should, maybe counsel them on other ways of dealing with the gut issues that can happen, whether that's supplementation or whatever it is that they're willing to accept as part of such a diet, from a, produce perspective. I'm not a big believer in judging people.
I love your approach because I agree with you on both ends. I'm not a big fan of especially the carnivore diet, but I have a lot of colleagues, even, PAs and people in my network that are just thriving and they love it. And they say they feel so good on it. They've lost weight. They're pooping better, right? Like almost like a miracle diet for them, quote unquote. But then you also have other patients whose lipids skyrocket, right? And we don't, the science isn't quite there yet, other than if they're just a hyper responder to cholesterol in their diet. But I love your approach to educate them and to not judge them, because really the key and outcomes for all of the different dietary patterns is that they can sustain the diet and that they are committed long term. And so if a patient is excited about this diet, they're thriving in it, they're able to commit to it, I think, like you said, we should support them, and offer other alternatives. I think fiber is a big one that's missing. And, sometimes it's just, can you do one apple a day, or can you include vegetable with dinner maybe? So we can kind of modify it a little bit, or even like you had said, supplementation or medication intervention. So I really, really love that approach. But I'm curious as to what point or what red flags should we watch for if we are, supporting a patient who's on a carnivore diet. They love it. They want to continue on it. What are some red flags that we should look for on their labs to ensure that they are safe long term?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, looking at the lipids or lipoproteins, looking at their ApoB is important. I think looking at other things like uric acid, I don't know how much you talk about that on this podcast, but I think that that is also worthwhile. Looking at, markers of inflammation, probably the easiest and most commonly used one is HSCRP. I think looking at those things will give you an idea as, more or less detrimental. Again, I'm not a fan under almost any circumstances, but, like, there is a wide variety of responses to, these diets in terms of lipids in particular. You'll see some people, increased saturated fats doesn't do that much. It may, increase their levels a little bit. And some people it's like, sky high. They'll go into, very scary territory. So just following the labs, I think, is important. And it helps you better work with patients and also show them, right? You could just say, like, look, here are the normal ranges. You're like 3 times that. Let's talk about doing something.
Yeah, and going beyond just kind of pointing out the ranges and giving an intervention, maybe even pointing out the risk with what, having that elevated number is a risk of stroke. And we're not trying to fear people. We're not trying to make them afraid of anything, but really giving them that education and that reality of what could potentially happen if we don't intervene and make a few changes. Okay, that was a super fun conversation all about lipids and weight management. But I want to move into our next topic, which is about muscle preservation, because that's a huge concern, especially right now with the influx of all of these different anti-obesity medications. So, why is lean mass protection so critical during weight loss?
There's at least two ways to look at this. One is that our lean mass has like a mechanical functional, use, which is basically to get us around, to protect us from falls, to allow us to do our daily activities, carry our groceries, things like that. And most people are not thinking about that when they're young because we generally have enough to live our daily lives. But in the elderly, it becomes a real thing. It's not uncommon for people to be, I don't know, in their 70s, 80s, even 60s sometimes, and not have any particular disease that is preventing them from living a normal life, but they have just such low muscle mass and strength, or cardiovascular conditioning, by the way. I know we're not talking about that, but it's another aspect where they're basically functionally disabled just because of that. And I don't think anybody wants that. So that's one aspect. The other is that lean mass, muscle in particular, skeletal muscle, has metabolic functions. There's lots of data out there that show that people with low lean mass have higher risks of fatty liver, all-cause death, all the bad stuff, basically. So, it has sort of a mechanical function and a metabolic function. And I really think that, we want to pay attention to this when we're young, because that's actually when most of the action happens. It's a lot harder to rebuild things when you're older than it is to stay at a healthy level when you're young.
Yeah. And, exercise is a part of those pillars in obesity care. Although I focus primarily on nutrition on this podcast, when you are working with a patient who's trying to lose weight, it should absolutely be a priority to preserve and even maybe gain skeletal muscle mass. And so you've actually argued before that resistance training may be even more important than pushing, high levels of protein in the diet. And so how do we educate our patients between the importance of both resistance training and getting enough protein in?
The way that I look at it is like this. Our bodies are very flexible metabolic machines. You can look at, traditional cultures, that are in different parts of the world, and they have radically different diets, and they can be, fairly healthy and robust on different diets. And the reason for that is very simple. We can use nutrients in different ways. I'm not going to talk too much about carbohydrates and fat now because we're focused on protein, but protein can be used for essential functions, making enzymes, making certain hormones, etc., structural elements of cells. It can be used for things like building muscle. And then it can also be used for things like gluconeogenesis. It can be turned into other stuff. We need signals in order to send the protein in a certain direction. One of those signals has to do with the composition of the diet. Right? If you're eating, let's say, a huge percentage of your calories from protein, some of that is going to go to gluconeogenesis because you need some glucose to feed your brain, et cetera, your red blood cells, those kinds of things. But some of the other signals have to do with physical activity, and in particular, to use the protein for muscle preservation and muscle building. Resistance is the signal. Now, we can think of the sort of like regular amounts of resistance through everyday life as some signal. We know this because if you put people on bed rest, they'll lose lean mass at a very fast rate. But the best signal is very intense physical exercise. And very intense is actually something that most of your patients probably have never experienced in their lives. And we're talking about something that, you can do if we're talking about lifting weights or something like a push-up. You can do somewhere between, let's just give a wide range, let's say 5 and 25 repetitions. And then when you're at the end of that set, you can't do many more at all, if anything, 1 or 2. That's something that most people haven't experienced. So it requires some education to explain to people what is necessary, why the resistance training is so important, and what it means practically.
Okay, for someone who's feeling overwhelmed because they've never exercised in their life, and maybe we are talking about, really high intensity exercise, how do we get them there without them feeling scared or overwhelmed? Because that can seem really intimidating.
So I don't think you have to start at that place. You start with something, right? First, you talk to the person. If they're a complete and utter couch potato, you might just get them walking, right? And initially. And that's it. And how much walking? I don't know. That might be 10 minutes. You know what I mean? For some of us, 10 minutes might be just like, we don't even think about it. But for other people, 10 minutes is like, oh, I really just exerted myself. You start where people are. And then you get there over some period of time. If they really are total couch potato, you may not have them resistance training for a while. But here's the interesting thing. Because intensity is relative, whatever you give them initially, or if it's a stimulus for them, then it's a stimulus for them. And that has also been shown, by the way, looking at older people. I don't know if this is weight loss studies, but looking at older people, even just increasing their steps a day will preserve muscle mass to some degree, not the same as, intense resistance training. So start people where they are and give them a challenge, work with them on what they're willing to accept. And I think it's really important to have a positive experience with physical activity. If their first experience is negative, they're never going to do it again. Get them a positive experience, get them liking it over time. And I think that's the path forward.
Yeah, I love that approach. Okay, we all know there's a huge emphasis on high protein. I feel like that's all we're hearing all the time. But I'm curious as to what your recommendation is for the specific range when counseling patients on getting enough protein.
Yeah. So I base this on, the literature that I read, which is mostly obesity literature, to be honest with you. I'm not like an aging scientist or, protein biochemist. But I usually tell people between 1.2 and 1.6 grams per kilo a day. I don't base it on their ideal body weight. I think it's too complicated. But an easy way to say it is I tell people to aim for 3/4 grams per pound of body weight. So in other words, like if they're weighing 200 pounds, that would be 150 grams. That's hard for most people. And I'll tell them usually that's a North Star. You know what I mean? If they're starting at 60, let's go for, 80 or 90 first and see. And then you work with them on strategies of how to get there.
Oh, I really love that approach, what you had just said, because you're right, like 150 for some patients who are maybe even at like 60 grams in a day, getting from 60 to 150 is very challenging. So I really like how you said to get them there gradually and slowly so it doesn't feel like such a complete diet overhaul. Okay, you have said that obesity is not just about weight, and I agree with you. So, but can you unpack what you mean by that for our listeners?
Yeah. So first of all, a very famous obesity physician and researcher, Robert Kushner, recently said, excess weight doesn't cause obesity. Obesity causes excess weight. So, I think about it in three different ways. Number one is that most of the drivers appear to be in the brain. One line of evidence is that a lot of the genetic polymorphisms that contribute to BMI are actually coding for brain-related proteins, right? Or neuronal-related proteins, things like that. Number two is that we know this just, from the fact that it's so difficult to maintain weight loss. And that's, being caused primarily by central mechanisms that increase appetite and decrease the drive for physical activity and also decrease, basal metabolic rate once people lose weight. So it's very hard to keep weight off. Why would that be? If weight was the problem, then you lose it and you're done, right? Well, clearly that's not the issue. The issue is that there's something driving the weight. So the weight is not the primary thing. There's something underneath it, and that's mostly lies in the brain. The second thing is that I don't think of it only as weight because, again, I care about the person's health, which means that what I'm really concerned about is what is the weight doing to their health, right? All the things that it's affecting the risks for other diseases and things like that. I do care about the weight also to some degree because it might be affecting their self-image, their physical ability to get around. And that's the last thing I'm going to talk about, which is we cannot discount like the psychological impacts of living with excess weight. It's not just the weight itself. It's about how a person feels about it, how they perceive it, how it affects their daily life. And that's actually going to vary a lot between individuals. So that should be a major factor in how you interact with people and patients, both.
I don't think clinicians think about that enough is really how it's impacting them. And like you had said, some people, they have significant body positivity and maybe they are in that camp of health at every size. And then other individuals, may have been judged for their body size since they were like 6 years old and they have significant body image issues and psychological distress from it. So we really have to tread lightly and be compassionate and just be aware of what their life experience is living in their body. So I love that. And that brings me to my last question. I would love to know, what does success in obesity treatment look like to you?
Yeah, I mean, I look at it sort of through the lens of improving their health issues. I want to get to a point where we improve people's weight-related health issues, whatever they may be. They could be, physiological things. We talked about lipids and glucose and other things like that. They could be mechanical things. They could also be psychological things, depending on the person, right? So doing it in a way, though, that is sustainable and that helps the person feel more in control and not less. I kind of think that if you help a person lose weight and they feel like worse, I really don't know what you've done for them.
I love your approach to obesity care because I completely agree with you. I think it's the whole picture. It's not just about body composition. It's definitely not just about their body size or their weight on their scale. It's also the other things. How much joy do they have in life? Are they able to do the things that they wanted to do with their kids? Are they able to feel confident on stage? And I talk a lot about that, those non-scale victories. And so if you guys wanted to dive deeper into how do you approach this, don't forget we've got several modules inside the obesity medicine nutrition course that covers all of it, including how to overcome dieting failures or how to help your patient when they feel like a failure. And so if you wanted to get access to the course, you can get 10 and a half continuing education credits. Just go to examroomnutrition.com/course. And don't forget to use code POD15 for 15% off just for my podcast family. Tzvi, thank you so much for the gift of your time. It's been really fun having this conversation with you and just unpacking your thoughts on obesity care. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.